Today, what we're going to look at is meetings with the mind. The first class that we did this term was on how artists look at real people doing portraits, and then how they look at real places, looking at through two countries. Now we're going to go back into the mind of the artist, where the artist puts a spin on what the creation is going to be from perhaps dreams, perhaps from the subconscious. We're going to look at these works beyond, looking beyond what the eye can see and the intellect understands. Sometimes those of us, a lot of us are kind of academic. I mean, we are taking classes, and we think that understanding through the intellect is the only way. Sometimes it's not the only way. Sometimes there might be something transcendent or something beyond what the intellect can understand and the eye can see. Let's look at this first work. What do you see? If you were in a museum and you went by this one, the first thing you'd look at was, oh, that's another religious thing, you know, it's got the old halo. Well, right away you're reading it, you read a symbol, which is the halo. It also has the halo with the cross on it. I've had enough of religious paintings, and you might just walk on by because you don't connect with everything. But then you might look a little bit closer and notice the disembodied hands, a disembodied head who is spitting at what we probably have decided is Christ. We can barely see him through the veil. We see the crown of thorns. Another disembodied piece is aiming. So this is beyond realistic. It's surrealistic. It's supernatural. Let's look a little bit further. That picture was painted in 1443 by a Dominican monk, Fra Angelico, fantastic painter, who decorated the walls of a convent in Florence along with some other friars. And it is part of this masterpiece called The Mocking of Christ. You'll notice that in the front of it, we have the Virgin Mary, who is pondering. That's the symbol for pondering that she has with her hands. She also has a halo. There's also Saint Dominic there on the right. And perhaps the vision that we see is a dreamlike vision. Perhaps they are dreaming of this version of the mocking of Christ. Well, here is another unusual work. We see people, a person in a test tube, a bird in another kind of a bubble, nude females, some cavorting people, oranges, pretty tough to get, but let's go on. We're going to be looking at that artist, the surreal world of who I've admitted is my favorite painter, and this is the opening of my favorite painting. I've got lots of favorites, but he kind of is the king of the favorites. And this is the world as he pictures it on the outside of his masterpiece. A transparent world, a world that you can look into and see all sorts of wonders, the sky and the earth and what's beyond. When you open up that world, you get this triptych, which is the Garden of Earthly Delights. It's in the Prado, and here you see the people in front of it. I think I've seen it a couple, maybe 3 times. I know him twice. I know that the last time I saw it, I was in a crowd like this trying to look at the details once again. And the man next to me started laughing. And I thought, it's so cool. He sees the whimsy in it. But he had headphones on, and probably somebody much more knowledgeable than I was narrating it. But let's look at the picture and start understanding it up close. Here it is, The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, done in 1510. Let's look at a video talking about what Bosch is doing here.
There is no other artist quite like Hieronymus Bosch. Whilst Da Vinci was finishing the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo was decorating the Sistine Chapel, this Dutch painter was conjuring up nightmarish hellscapes, full of grotesque and nonsensical creatures. But why did this artist create such disturbing paintings? Are they the product of a lively imagination, or are they the result of a troubled mind, afflicted by intense and frightening hallucinations? Let's investigate the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and get a glimpse of the artist behind his strange and unsettling work. Very little is known about the life of Hieronymus Bosch. Even his portrait, which you can see now, was made 30 years after his death. We do know that he was born sometime during the mid-1400s and probably spent most of his life in the Dutch town of 's-Hertogenbosch. He grew up in a time of deep religious anxiety. In late medieval Christianity, ideas about sin, death, and the devil were becoming more sophisticated, and descriptions of hell, like in Dante's Inferno, were becoming more vivid. There was a genuine fear that demonic forces lived amongst the population, a fear that led to the first European witch hunts, something that would only increase in the coming centuries. This was the spiritual environment that Hieronymus Bosch emerged from, one where devotion and fear were intertwined. It is clear to have affected him deeply, as a preoccupation with sin and punishment pervade his work. Let's start with his most well-known painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. It's a triptych with 3 panels depicting 3 unusual scenes. The first, on the left here, is based on the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Set in the Garden of Eden, we can see familiar animals like elephants and giraffes, but just below them is a freakish bipedal dog creature. Over here, a frog-mouthed bird eats a toad, and emerging out of this pool are hideous multi-headed reptiles. Even in paradise, there is already a sense of discord, anticipating the horrors that lie ahead. The middle panel is a non-biblical scene featuring hundreds of naked people frolicking in a lush garden. Strange organic structures dominate the background, giving an otherworldly feel to it. The level of detail is astonishing, but highlights include people crawling into this giant egg, a multi-legged dancing owl, and finally, a cute cat-like unicorn. The inhabitants of this panel seem to be indulging in acts of lust and gluttony, 2 of the 7 deadly sins. The last panel is a disturbing picture of hell, with all kinds of eccentric and horrific punishments. At the bottom, we have a pig dressed up in a nun's habit. It's attempting to get someone to sign a pact with the devil. This bird demon consumes its helpless victims and then defecates them into the cesspool below. Over here, we have a demonic choirmaster leading a dirge, crucifying a man on a giant lyre. It also appears to be tattooing music onto someone's backside. Some have actually put this to music, and it sounds a bit like this. Dominating the centre, we have the so-called tree man, named after his stumpy legs. Some believe that this face is a self-portrait of the artist. There are so many interpretations to this piece at large, and all the little scenes have their own theological messages. You could spend hours deciphering even just one of them, but there's an idea that most people do agree upon. It's a warning against lust and the pursuit of physical pleasure.
Look at some details, because just taking any one panel could be an artwork in itself. And so what I wanted you to have a chance to do would be to look at these close up, and all you want to do is to just look at the images, not care how they're painted, but where they take you in terms of imagination. So here's the first 2 that are in Eden. Here are some of the earthly delights. The fruit, of course, is having to do with the fruits of evil that people do. They're all sinful, they're lustful, they're having a lot of fun. And that's why it's called the earthly delights. I've been seeing some analyses that say that the guy in blue in the big chair is the judge in hell, who's helping decide who gets to go to hell and who gets to rise to heaven. And then, of course, is your tree man. The tree man, of course, take years just in itself, just having fun with, interpreting. Here's the detail of the frog-like character with a face and is behind the woman with the frog imprints on her body, the pig with a nun's habit, and as we learned in still life, music itself is a pleasure that we shouldn't really allow ourselves if we're going to be righteous folk. There are many books about just that picture. One of them, and of course I've talked about this picture before, but I hope there's new information this time. I've read this and I don't know that much more about the picture, but Terry Tempest Williams is a philosopher, a naturalist, a poet, beautiful writer who spent 7 years studying the picture, and she equates it with all manner of life. These books are all possibilities. I have several. The one that I really like is the one in the upper left-hand corner because it has this wonderful pull-out that you can do and examine the picture with. Here is his last judgment, again a triptych, where you have Eden much calmer down here. In the middle, you have life on earth, and to the right, the demons of hell. Here's some details from that. Now, I call it whimsy. I can't help but think that Bosch might have had a little sense of humor with the way he creates some of his characters, but they would be frightening. They are personifications of the demons that some of us might have in our head from time to time. They're the monsters under the bed, let free. They're the nightmare in the closet. Here's I'm sorry, I'm through. This is Michelangelo's Last Judgment. It is certainly different from the way Bosch did it. Michelangelo's working around the same time. And he shows Christ saying who can go to hell and who can go to heaven. The ones on our left are the ones that he said that can go to heaven, and the angels are carrying them up. On the right, the ones that are damned to hell, he's sending down. Next to him is his mother, the Virgin Mary, who just really isn't liking the whole thing and is kind of looking away. But he too goes to the surreal, the supernatural, the imagination. We talked about, when we're talking about portraits, there's his self-portrait as just a hanging bag of skin, and it's being held by St. Bartholomew, and that was the way he was martyred, was having his skin flayed. In the middle, we have the thinking man. What have we wrought? What's going on? He is being pulled down by the angels. Being Michelangelo's, these are very buff angels, and they are pictured. He loved to show human anatomy, much different from the angels as we think of them sort of ethereally. On the right, we have the unfortunate portrait of one of Michelangelo's enemies, who is wrapped by a snake, who unfortunately has found his vital parts, and Michelangelo is taking a little bit of revenge in this phantasmagoria. Here's his torment of St. Anthony. It really doesn't strike you when you first look at it as a very religious painting. So here, wonderful demons. I mean, these are just fodder for Disney later on and for of all sorts of fairy tales. He did that when he was 13. Now we're going to a different artist who was very, very influenced by Bosch. And we've seen him before. He does so many different types of things, but he also went to the supernatural, the surreal, the fantasy, the weird. This is his Fall of the Rebel Angels. These are angels who are getting kicked out of heaven and they're falling to hell. Here are some details showing these are winged angels anyway, looking more like the angels that we know, falling into what we see on the right, again with demons and monsters. More details, again, out of his imagination. So they could be hallucinations, they could be attempts to put into something that we can look at as parishioners, as we see some of these in churches, so that we are afraid of hell. But they make awfully great masterpieces. This one is called, in English, Mad Meg. And this is a woman who in the middle is leading a legion of peasant women as they attack the corrupt forces at the mouth of hell. It is a commentary also on the pillaging of Europe by armed forces and people's revenge. Let's look at some details. There that is, look at the mouth of hell there. It is in a giant face. One of the people whose mouth and behind are the same as down at the bottom. That's something that you see in Bruegel. And then on the right, you see Mad Meg. She's picking up all she can, all the loot she can, as she's going through the ravaged land. Here is one of Bruegel's great masterpieces, The Triumph of Death. There's a wonderful video that I'm going to post on my website about this picture, but it was just too long to fit in today. Primarily, what we're looking at is a picture of something very similar to what we just went through, or are we still going through it? It is a picture of the plague ravishing the land. Let's look at some details. Sorry, before we do that, I want to talk about the fact that that picture was featured in one of the books that we read in Tackling the Tough Ones with Renee Curry, who can make the postmodern literature understandable far better than I can make this kind of painting understandable. But in that book, in the prologue, DeLillo talks about a true fact, which was there was this game, this World Series game in Yankee Stadium. It was the one where there was the shot, the baseball that was hit, that they call it the shot that was heard around the world. And in the stands were some famous people. One of them was J. Edgar Hoover, and that's true. And now what's not true, there was a picture in the New York Times during that time of the painting that we just saw, The Triumph of Death. And it is sort of a theme for the rest of the novel. The apocalypse that is going on in The Triumph of Death is what DeLillo is describing so often in the underworld, which he describes in modern times. Here's some details. What you have in it are skeletons that are romping through the world and taking people off to their heavenly maker, to heaven, to hell, to the underworld, to the world beyond. And they're doing normal things. They're burying people. Here they are with a king. The time is running out. The skeleton is saying, you're going to. Here they are making, one's making music down at the bottom. This is kind of a dance of death where the skeletons are saying, look at, you're having a good time here. You've been at this table, you've been playing these games, but your time is up. So the skeletons are mixing with the real world. It is what we call a trope. It's a meme. It's a kind of a thing that you can see often in literature and in art. Hans Holbein did the Dance of Death in a series of wood blocks. Once again, you see the frolicking skeletons that are taking people off to their demise. Mimicking, sort of mocking the people, playing music for them as they carry them out. So there's this irony between the dance and the skeletons who far into the other world. I mean, they've lost their skin and everything. They're really in another world of some sort, taking off the ones who thought their life was so important. This is done in the 15th century. You can see it down at the bottom, this long mural, which combines skeletons who haven't lost all their skin. They're a little bit more, with it. And again, reminding us all that we will be going, that no matter what your station in life is, you too will be going to the other world. Another novel that we read and it is a contemporary Chinese piece, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. And and she may correct me, but I would say that it's a piece of magical realism. And what we've been looking at in art is magical realism. This was depicted also in The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman, where Ingmar Bergman plays chess with death. It's also the idea of playing chess as skeletons was in The Seventh Day. And it's also something that was used in the Pirates of the Caribbean. And I've learned since that the Imagineers, who are the artists at Disney who create these wonderful rides, actually created a game that would deadlock and theoretically go on forever. These skeletons will be in the netherworld forever. Diego Rivera also portrayed the when you are in life, there is death in the festival of the Day of the Dead, where you see the people celebrating, the kids, the people down in front are wearing masks. Throughout the town, throughout Mexico, people have candies, they have devotional things to skeletons. And once again, they are shown in all sorts of positions that say, we are here in the midst of life. Here is his dream of a Sunday, not at the Grand Jatte, as we saw last week, but in Alameda Park. It's a great mural. You see the people all celebrating down below. And in the middle, you see that detail with what is called a Catarina. She is the dolled up skeleton, sort of the queen of the Day of the Dead festival. You might know the people to the our left of the Catarina, Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera's wife, and Diego dressed up as a kid. Very recently in a New Yorker, they always have this cartoon caption contest, and they had this one. I wonder if you think of looking at this particular image and thinking, what would I caption it? The guy on the left making a move, the skeleton death on the right, giving him a come hither kind of a view. So what we're looking at come all the way down. These are old, very ancient types of ways of looking at life and death. The dream. In the Age of Enlightenment, in the 18th century, the idea was that if you dream, monsters appear and reason goes away. Well, Henry Fuseli did the two versions of this nightmare because it was such a popular painting. He was getting a lot of good press from it. And here he shows two languid ladies, or ladies sprawled on their couches, but look at those wonderful monsters that appear in her dreams. Francisco Goya did a famous woodblock during his Capriccio series, this very dark series when he was so afflicted with physical and mental problems. And this is called the sleep of reason. In other words, when reason goes away, produces monsters. Monsters come, bats and owls. So he also was portraying the same idea. Another dream. This is, first of all, just look at it as a painting. What do you see? That you didn't even know the name of it. You didn't bother to look at the little attribution plaque next to it. Sleeping guy, the Orient, exotic, wonderful light and dark effect, the dream coming out of the pipe. It is said that this is a eunuch who is dreaming of making love to one of the harem ladies, one of the harem slaves. His dream is reminding him with the little Cupid behind with the knife that his anatomy won't allow him to have that kind of an interaction. If you look at the cement pilings, the stone pilings in the front, you see that handprint. That is called a chasma. It's a symbol to ward off evil. Another dream picture that we've seen before is from Henri Rousseau. We're now in the 19th century. He was called the douanier, like he was a primitive painter, but there's nothing primitive about this picture. It's a magnificent, magnificent feeling of a dream. And we wonder, we didn't have to really look at the attribution to see that it's magical, that it's surrealistic, supernatural. The lion seems to be passing the gypsy by. Is this whole thing his dream? It leaves us to decide. Marc Chagall, we looked at portraits when he was having a dream of his village. Here he dreams of love. He has many, many pictures of him and his wife, Bella. Here they are floating over the rooftops. And on the right, there they are in bed, and the angel is coming down, flying over the village. And he's dreaming of love and life back in the village. Vincent van Gogh said, and we have a lot of his writings in his letters to Theo, and we do know a lot about his internal life as opposed to some of the painters that we looked at earlier. It is only too true that a lot of artists are mentally ill. It's a life which, to put it mildly, makes one an outsider. I'm all right when I completely immerse myself in work, but I'll always remain half crazy. From what I understand, Vincent van Gogh did deal with many mental issues, as well as with alcoholism and lots of problems in his life. But from what I understand, he did not paint when he was having one of his mental issues. But that, of course, is just from what I've read. So is this painting from madness? It's painted while he was in an insane asylum that he committed himself to. Is it madness to talk about the swirl of heavenly bodies and picture it? It works beautifully just to look at as an image, but it also leads us to think a little bit about the cosmos that's far from understandable. Edvard Munch, we've looked at this picture before. I believe that it's finally decided that the figure in the front who has a skeletal face is not actually screaming. That is not the scream, but the scream is everything outside the figure, the chaos of the world. The way I opened the masterpieces this morning, all of the loud noises that we hear all the time, that the scream holding his or her ears is trying to get rid of. Edvard Munch did suffer a great deal from mental illness. And it's found now that on that, where that little yellow circle is, he wrote, "Can only have been painted by a madman." PG, I'm saying that because we've seen this picture before. You might want to play the guessing game of who did this in the 19th century. Did a vision which is being portrayed by showing these women. These are not nuns, these are Breton women that he often painted, wearing their typical regional hats, coming back from a sermon. And they all have this collective vision of Jacob wrestling the angel from that sermon. So what we're picturing is a vision within the painting. And if you guessed it, that was Paul Gauguin, you were right. Here again, very similar to the dream that we saw earlier. The spirit of the dead, the reclining Tahitian woman, has death in the background, monsters that might invade her as she sleeps. This is, I know I've shown this before, but it's so perfect for now. It is also a type of a triptych that we saw with Bosch earlier. It also is answering some of the same questions. You read it from right to left. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? So on the right, we come from the family, from the birth, from the baby. In the middle, we have a life on earth. We sin, we pick the apple from the tree like in Eden. There are gods behind us, myths that we believe in, family life that we enjoy. And then looking all the way over on the left, you see the elderly figure doing the same thing that the scream is doing, holding hands over ears and saying, "Where are we going?" You've also seen this by G.O., where we take very recognizable, these are not monsters, these are not weird things, very recognizable things, a flower, stormy sky, hills, the ram's head, the bones, put them together and they transcend the sum of the parts and become supernatural. That was Georgia O'Keeffe. I'm comparing the work on the right to one that we've seen and we'll see again today by David Lagar. This fabulous picture where she is looking at a landscape through that incredibly, it's rhythmical. To me, it's like musical, the beautiful way that she's portrayed this very mundane object of a pelvis. So she's made it more than it really is and given it that mysterious twinge. I've shown this picture before, The Wounded Deer. This is a self-portrait where the artist is picturing being inundated by arrows, tortured against a pretty understandable landscape, FK. Sure you pictured this as Frida Kahlo. This masterpiece of hers is, I think, so definitional to what we're looking at today. It's in different levels. If you look at the very back, you can see in the sky sort of a mother figure, a female face. And this is the entire universe, with light on one side, the dark on the other, coming down to caress the whole picture with the white arm on the side, one side, the brown arm on the other. Underneath her is a clay figure, and that clay figure is one of the myths of the Mayans of a mother of earth, and she's made of earth. Beneath that is Frida Kahlo, and she is a mother figure holding her baby. Her baby is her husband, Diego Rivera, with a third eye, which denotes wisdom. So this is one where, from what I understand, she is reconciling this marriage. They were married, divorced, married again, saying, that's my role. My role is to be a mother figure for him. We're back to David Lagarde, just reminding you of how he takes classical images, setting them against a background that is real, which is, as we know, is our Monterey Bay that we talked about last week. Now, this is not David Lagarde. Obviously, the style is different. Do you recognize the style? Do you know it? He also takes classical figures and sets them against a sort of realistic background, but there is an eeriness, a supernatural quality to what he's doing in this series of paintings. The artist's name that we just looked at is P.P. And I'm sure you're figuring out who it is. Again, we have figures set against the ocean, more and more wrapped up in his head, coming from his mind as to how he wants to portray them against these nudes. Single nude figure, the left, in a classical way. In the middle, you can just make out that that is an image of a woman. And on the right, we have two figures who are entwined. So that was Pablo Picasso. He said, along with our theme today, I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them. On the right, we have a picture that is very much like something that Matisse would have done, but Matisse would probably not have done a still life on the table done in a Cubist style. So we have two styles here, which are adding to the mystery of the scene. On the right, we have The Dream, and it is a portrait of one of his mistresses, Marie-Thérèse Walter, much younger than he was. And we might look at her face, we might look at the symbolism at the top of her face and make some judgments as to what the dream Picasso might be hoping she's having, just guessing. Then, as I was working on this, I learned that another portrait of Marie Walter, another scene of a background such as we've looked at before, a surrealistic type of a setting, was just sold for $67 million. Now we have Picasso's crucifixion. Once again, he sees it as his mind sees it. We can see the cross, we can see Christ, we can see some lamentation if we really work for it. We can see a lot of other things too. I think I see Don Quixote over on the side. And then on the right, we're going to have another mystery artist, as we had Bob Dylan last week. And this mystery artist is also picturing the crucifixion with his wife as a lamenting Mary, probably Mary, either Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary down below. Very realistic portrayal. I'd say the opposite of the way Picasso chose to present it. Now, for something completely different from the way we started the class today, we're going to have a cartoon with these two sparring guys. I'm funny looking, look who's talking. You want to take this outside? Well, it's Salvador versus Pablo, another hint to our next artist. And things are about to get surreal. It's time for surrealism. And you might have known that's sort of what we've been working up at. Now, I cannot eloquently explain surrealism as much as I've studied it, looked it up, Googled. Let's look at a video and see if they can do it a little bit better than I can. But I think the main idea is that it's not fully understandable.
Melting clocks, bowler hats, peculiar household objects, dream sequences, but also uncanny incidents, dorm room posters, more dream sequences, and according to Merriam-Webster, the year 2016. The word surrealism has become a catch-all for the bizarre, the irrational, the hallucinatory. But when it emerged in Europe during the tenuous, turbulent years following World War I and leading up to World War II, surrealism positioned itself not as an escape from life, but as a revolutionary force within it, a movement aimed at the wholesale liberation of the individual, aesthetic as well as political, literary as well as visual, originating in Paris but ultimately international, freed from the constraints of a singular style or medium, yet driven by a charismatic leader. Surrealism was ambitious, contradictory, and complex, and it has a history you might not guess from how the word is used today. This is the case for surrealism. The term surrealism first appeared in the writings of French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who used it in 1917 to describe Jean Cocteau's ballet Parade and his own play The Breasts of Tiresias. For Apollinaire, surrealism meant the fruits of the human imagination freed from the task of imitating nature. Its roots lay in the ethos of Romanticism and eccentric 19th century figures like the symbolist fantasist Gustave Moreau, the self-taught artist and customs agent Henri Rousseau, the disquieting visionary Arnold Böcklin, and writers like Edgar Allan Poe. Surrealism also emerged out of the riotous spirit of Dada, a movement originating in Zurich and Berlin, which sought to upend artistic traditions and disrupt the conventionality of modern life, weaponizing nonsense against the institutions that had brought about the catastrophe that was World War I. Yet the surrealists were after not just disrupting the world order through nonsense, but reinventing it through experimental tactics. The first of these is automatism, or involuntary unwilled action. In 1924, a young poet named André Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto, defining surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, dictated by thought, in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Breton had been experimenting with this pure state since 1919, when he co-authored a book-length stream of consciousness poem called The Magnetic Fields. Breton's automatism is based on the work of Sigmund Freud, who theorized that human subjects are divided between our conscious minds, dominated by reason and restrained by social manners, and the unconscious, our hidden reservoir of instincts, desires, and unprocessed experiences that our conscious mind works hard to repress. To unleash the unconscious, surrealists did things like transcribing dreams and recording trance states under the auspices of their Bureau of Surrealist Research. The surrealists insisted that our repression was not just psychic, but social, and that liberating the unconscious would have collective, politically revolutionary consequences. Transform the world, said Marx. change life, said Rilke. For us, it's one and the same, Breton wrote. Surrealist magazines were filled with dream accounts, stream of consciousness writings, automatic drawing exercises, even rapid-fire questionnaires, all serving to unleash the unconscious by circumventing the control of the conscious mind. One of the first surrealist films, made by Germaine Dulac and Antonine Artaud, explored the consciousness of a clergyman afflicted with impure thoughts. It was advertised as a dream on the screen, and set up a parallel between films and dreams, both being spaces of fantasy and automatized imagination. The Surrealists engaged in chance operations in pursuit of automatism, often outsourcing creative control to their materials. André Masson poured sand over skeins of glue to produce turbulent landscapes or mythological beasts. Man Ray illuminated objects on light-sensitive paper to create unpredictable compositions from their shadows. Others employed frottage or rubbings, brûlage or the burning of photographic negatives, and decalcomania, in each case surrendering control to the process and aspiring to what Breton called the marvelous, or that part of the self that lies beyond the reach of reason. They also outsourced creative control to each other, playing literary and drawing games, such as the famous Exquisite Corpse, where the final poem or image was the product of their collective imagination. Chance, for the Surrealists, also meant long, directionless walks recorded in the novels Paris Peasant and Nadja. It included chance encounters with so-called found objects, such as the ones Breton described seeing in flea markets, which he claimed could resolve both psychological disturbances and artistic blocks. The famous line of the poet the Comte de Lautréamont, as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table, became a kind of catchphrase for the movement, encapsulating its pursuit of the unexpected.
So, as it said in the video, Surrealism grew out of Dada. Dada grew out of World War I, where, almost like today, we can't make really a lot of sense out of all that's happening. And Dada makes no sense. The word itself is like a child who is just saying, Dada, Dada. So it is not for the intellect to understand. Let's just look at a few of the artists. Marcel Duchamp wasn't always like, when we talk about these eras, these schools, calling somebody a surrealist and somebody else is a cubist, it all overlaps. That's why I don't concentrate on them. We don't want to memorize that. We just want to look at the work, because Marcel Duchamp was a cubist when he did his masterpiece, The Nude Descending the Staircase. But he was definitely a Dadaist when he created this, his most well-known piece, which is a real urinal that has a signature on it. And he said, you know, anything can be art. So Dada was anti-art, anti all that was believed about all those pictures that we just got through looking at the first part of the class. He did what are called ready-mades. We have the magnificent bicycle wheel mounted on a stool. That is one of his ready-mades. A ball of twine. Can you figure out that under the ball of twine, we have a bicycle seat and handlebars, then a snow shovel. And on the right, do you recognize this? It's a bottle rack. So these are what were called ready-mades. You can put them under glass. Even today, we're having things that are as devoid as what we normally think of as art, put under glass or sold for millions of dollars, but it's all, I think, fun. This one, putting a mustache and a goatee on the Mona Lisa, who in French is called La Joconde, is a little bit naughty, because if you pronounce the title, which is L-H-O-O-Q, it comes out with a French expression that has the connotation of her being very hot, hot to trot. She has a fire down below. On the right is another artist who portrays the Mona Lisa smoking a pipe. This was done before the Dadaist. Man Ray, another star on the Dadaist scene. You can see that he's primarily a photographer. You can see up above, I looked at that self-portrait and I immediately thought of the Francis Bacon self-portrait down below. I don't know if Francis Bacon was inspired by Man Ray. And then on the right, look at him with this piece. We'll see the piece later, but he was entranced by the shape of the spiral like you see on the head of this cello. So we will see that reoccurring in his work. This is one of his most famous photographs. It's called The Violin of Ingres. It's based on the odalisque that we've seen, which is a picture by Ingres. Also, it said that one of the hobbies that Ingres had was playing the violin. So I'm told, and I hadn't run into this before, that the expression Ingres' violin means hobby. And so that's why it has that sort of subtitle. Two more of his photographs. This is Kiki, the model is Kiki de Montparnasse, who was a model for many of the Dadaists. And he has these little tears, perhaps they're glycerin drops that he's dropped. On the right is the artist, Merritt Oppenheim, who is nude, judiciously hiding behind the wheel of a printing press covered by ink. Now, I noticed in our chat, we had one question for me to explain something, and I am at a loss for some of these, but I did not want to not put them in because I think they're interesting, things that I wanted to show. I wish I could explain what his motivation is, and I'm not sure he could have explained it either. This is Merritt Oppenheim's work. Her fur-lined, fur-covered cup and saucer and spoon, and her gloves with wooden fingers. It's said that she was out to lunch with Picasso and she was wearing a fur bracelet of her design. And he said, "You'd cover anything with fur." So she proved that she could. Here are some of Man Ray's ready-mades. Kind of the gift, kind of an unfortunate thing. I just can imagine when I used to have to iron my gym clothes, that I'd have to use that iron. The metronome, perpetually going back and forth. This is an eye of a lover that he had pasted on there, a broken up relationship. And there's that piece, that top of the cello with the spiral, where instead of strings, you have the unplayable horse's hair. Another thing that Man Ray was very involved with was chess. Malcolm Weintraub is in this class, brought this up when we were talking about playing chess, when we were studying the book, The Seventh Day. And this is a chess set that Malcolm has, the form of it, that Man Ray designed. And look at the spiral that he uses for the knight. And he is playing chess with a nude woman at the museum in Pasadena, where he's having a retrospective of his work. I said Man Ray, I meant Duchamp, sorry. Okay, about time to guess who our final Dadaist is. Here he's shown with Walt Disney. At one point, he thought that Walt Disney was the greatest American surrealist. And they made a short animated movie, Destino, together. Well, Walt Disney also made Fantasia, which is showing that you can animate music in art, and it also gets very surreal. And then another hint, we see our Mickey Mouse watch and it's melting. By this time, I'm pretty sure you know who our next artist is. These are some of his Dada images. He did Dada as well as Surrealism. The picture in the upper left is not a portrait of Mae West down below, but it is a room that is designed to look as sort of like an optical illusion, like Mae West. The settee is his famous Lips couch. The credenza in the back is forming a nose. Two pictures form the eyes. And then on the right, his very famous lobster telephone. He was in Monterey in 1941 and held a great big party at the Del Monte Hotel, which is now the Naval Postgraduate School. Here he is with his wife, Gala, who is the subject of many of his paintings. As a matter of fact, she was portraying the Mary at the cross in the painting that we saw earlier. He has a double-faced skeleton and face. He's also still here. We have, as far as I know, the last time I looked, we still have the Salvador Dali Museum. I looked through it as an Ollie class, and it's interesting. It doesn't have his major works. It has a lot of works on paper, but it's very interesting. We said that he was a Dadaist, but he says, first things first, I'm a surrealist. So we've been talking, as you know, about Salvador Dali. The persistence of memory is, I think, probably his most famous. It is sort of the most famous, it's kind of the icon of surrealism. Often in posters about surrealism, this is the picture you're going to see. And we're going to look at a video about the persistence of memory.
At the Museum of Modern Art, there is this tiny painting by Salvador Dali, which is the painting that everybody wants to see. That and Starry Night by Van Gogh are the two stars. And I thought it would be really interesting to talk about why this painting is so wildly popular. So this is The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali.
And here, I understand why people kind of connect to it now. I mean, anybody who's ever tried to make an album for a rock band is inspired by Salvador Dali. There's also this kind of fun of what are you looking at? He's really playing with reality, and it's kind of like a visual brain teaser.
Is that it? Is it so popular? Is it on album cover art because it's this attack on the rational, and that's such a seductive idea?
Yeah, it's mind trippy. I like the way you phrase it. It's an attack on the rational. I mean, I guess there might be more to it. That's my sense.
You were talking about album cover art and posters on, maybe a dorm room. And what's interesting is that these artists took these ideas really seriously. This was surrealism. This was painted in 1931. Dali, this Spanish artist, this Catalan artist, had just come to Paris and had joined the surrealist group.
I'm assuming he's considered significant because he was the first person to essentially do dreamscapes and these, as you mentioned, attack on the rational.
When you walk into this painting and visually, you enter into this really deep, open, and lonely space. And it's this really quiet image.
Yeah, it's kind of this desert scape, ignoring the melting clocks for a moment. You feel that, okay, if you were in this landscape, yes, time really does not really carry a lot of weight. You could just kind of wither there and die and no one would care. Even that kind of water in the background, there's no waves in it. It's like they've had time to settle down. There's literally no activity.
There's this unbearable sense of quiet. There is almost no movement, and I think it does feel very desert-like and very hot. Literally, time has melted, right? But we have this absurd environment. We do have this very naturalistic rendering, but the things that are being rendered are not naturalistic at all. You mentioned the dead tree on the left, but it's growing out of something that seems clearly man-made or at least geometric, a tabletop perhaps. You have ants that seem to be eating and attracted to a piece of metal as opposed to a piece of rotted flesh.
Oh, that's what that is. I couldn't fully make it out. Okay, so they're eating away at a timepiece. That's fascinating.
And of course, you have the drooping clocks. And that's such an interesting and evocative idea because time is something that is so regimented. Time is something that rules us, that is so associated with the industrial culture that we live in. And here, it responds to the environment as we respond to the environment.
Well, one, you have that tabletop, and there's another one in the background. And even the way that the light is set up, especially in that cliff, it looks like it's sunset. So it's kind of like, hey, just another day has passed. Who cares?
Now, there are some identifiable things. I mean, for all of the absurdity and for all of the impossibility of what we're seeing, there are some things that art historians have recognized. The cliffs in the back are, we think, the cliffs of the Catalonian coast in northern Spain, where Dali is from. And so this is his childhood, perhaps. Some art historians have concluded that that strange figure, almost a profile face, can you just make out an eye with extremely long lashes and perhaps a tongue under a nose?
This is the whole optical illusion part of Dali. Yeah, I thought it was like a blanket, but now I completely see the eyelashes. I thought it was a duck for a second too. I see the eyelashes and the top of a nose.
Yeah, Dali does that funny thing where one object can actually be several things at once, sometimes really convincingly. Some art historians think this is his face, but elusive and very much a kind of dream.
Well, I mean, that goes back into the category of this is more of that kind of door move, optical illusion type art.
Well, that's right. Surrealism posited that the rational world that we have so much faith in was perhaps not worthy of all of that faith, that the irrational was just as important, but was something that we had sublimated, something that we had tried to drive out of our life. And the way that these artists and writers thought about it was if only they could retrieve the world of the dream.
I'm wondering, when you saw that weird blob down at the bottom that could be a self-portrait, if you remembered back to the portraits we looked at, remember the ambassadors? It had that weird blob down at the bottom. And if you look at it from the side, it's a skull. I think that's what they were referring to when they said that it's like an optical illusion. Here's Dali's burning giraffe. And I have a little thing that he said here about Sigmund Freud, but primarily what he's saying is that these characters have all these drawers because of all the drawers that we have in our mind. So there's so many different subconscious thoughts that are going on. But the weird thing about this one is, let's look at the next slide. Although it's called the burning giraffe, it's the female figure here that is much more important. Both of these figures are propped up by crutches. He says that that's the case with all of us, that we are being propped up with sort of false illusions. But the burning giraffe is really kind of less. Notice the tiny figure next to the burning giraffe. So it is the specter of war. When we were looking at, I think we were looking at one of in Renee Curry's classes, talking about the surrealistic. Maria's husband, Phil, asked me if Dali was political. So I did a little research into it. He supported the Franco fascist in the Spanish Civil War, which of course would mean that he would have more fascist leanings. Also, I read, and of course I can't say that anything is really the truth, but it said his fascination with fascism reached a height in the 1930s. In an interview with Smithsonian Magazine, Dali allegedly talked about dreams of Adolf Hitler being a woman and ravishing him in that war, in that role. So these are part of many pictures that he has about war. Here is his face of war. Back to our skeletons. Look in the eyes. Look in the mouth. You'll see 3 more skeletons. And look in the eyes and the mouth of those skeletons and you see more. It's infinitesimal. We also see how large war looms over us, like a Medusa's head with the snakes. But down below we see just a very fragment of civilization, and it's overtaking everything. This is a complex one, going back to talking about dreams. Love the title. Dream caused by the flight of a bee around a pomegranate a second before awakening. Well, you actually see that pomegranate, which is an ancient symbol of fertility, down at the very bottom with a very tiny bee. And then you see a bigger pomegranate out of which springs a fish, and out of which springs tigers. And then, sadly, with the news currently, we make that connection with the gun. The gun is about to prick the sleeping languid lady like a bee would, which would wake her up. This is Dali, another one of his religious works. He was, from what I understand, quite a religious person in spite of some of the connotation of some of his work. This is his sacrament of the Last Supper. We call it the sacrament because we have people who are actually taking communion in front of the table, which was, of course, a feast. Look at the figure that is rising up into the sky in the background. Look how the outdoors comes indoors. In the 14th century, Duccio did the same thing, having the supplicants and communicants in front of the table slanted with the same kind of perspective that Dali is doing. We don't see halos in his pictures. We don't see the faces of the disciples. What we do see is a not realistic view of this incident, this feast, but a transcendent view. And of course, Leonardo also, one of his famous pictures is the Last Supper. And we've come down to having an image of Christ that looks sort of like what we saw in Duccio and under portraits, and like the way that Leonardo portrayed him. So that when we see a Christ who looks like somebody who might live in our neighborhood, it's a little bit jarring. The next artist is incredible. And she's sort of, I think, a well-known secret among the surrealists. Definitely a very powerful artist among the surrealists. Here in her Giantess, she is portraying this sort of earth mother figure. And it is said that she is speaking here about the powerful woman in art. Let's look at the next slide. Here we see it a little bit more detailed as compared with Bosch. I think it perhaps is stretching it a little bit to say that it looks like the Garden of Eden, that sort of castle kind of a place, but definitely in style. I really feel that she echoes Bosch. She has, it's very hard to see them, but they're very tiny people, women, all along her cloak in the middle, and some tiny people down below. And it's saying that this is giving homage to the other feminine surrealists. This picture is fun, and I'm going to be showing a video of it now. But before I do, just look at it as a picture. The first thing you do is say, well, does it get your attention? Is it something you want to figure out what it is, or perhaps know some of the symbolism, or is it just enough to look at it? So you sort of like name what you see. For example, the outdoors is indoors. For example, there's a character that's made entirely of textiles, an unusual looking animal in clothes, bubbles, and another dancing figure. Put together, it's really a great looking picture. Let's look at this video. I like the way this narrator has of looking at art. I think it's very down to earth.
I'm really moved by this artwork. It really just pulls me out of my environment. It gives me a different place to focus, a different thing to think about. Minotaurs and crystal balls, those aren't really things that we are faced with every day in our lives. And looking at works like this helped me focus on something outside of myself. My name is Elba Rodriguez, and I am a member specialist at MoMA. This is And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur by Renee Farrington, painted in 1953. I like to talk about the story behind the artist. I think that's very important to me when looking at the work. And it's important to note that Carrington was a rebellious person. She was expelled from school twice. Her parents wanted her to be a debutante. She came from a wealthy family, but she decided that wasn't for her. So she ran off. She went to the art world, Paris, and got really immersed in the art world. She was one of the famous surrealists, which can be seen in this work. She was very much into the occult and witchcraft, the mythical, the mystical, and already in the title, when she mentions, and then we saw the daughter of the Minotaur, she's taking us on this myth, on this story. And then the fact that she begins with the word and, the story continues. So the one thing that catches me the most here are the clouds and the stars. They appear to be billowing. They give the painting movement. You can really feel like you're a part of the environment. And then what's strange is this weird flower-faced figure, this minotaur with these tiny hands, but these bull hooves. There's these hooded, cloaked boys just looking here, and it looks like we're walking in on a crystal ball reading. You know, the minotaur is looking straight out at the viewer, almost like, who let you in here? What are you doing here? And looking at these two dogs on the corner, this tattered rose, this dancing figure with this weird flower coming out of its head, and this light almost coming from nowhere, really makes you think, what is going on here? You know, what are we seeing? And I think it's important to note that Carrington mentioned, she has a quote, loosely paraphrased, where it's a visual world. We shouldn't try to intellectualize it. It's a visual world that changes in space, and we should see it as such. And, you know, you really do feel like you're taken into this environment that pulls you away from where you are. You are really immersed in this idea. Sure, I believe in this minotaur. I believe in this flower-faced figure. This is really happening right now.
This is her self-portrait, and it is in a room, another animal that looks as if it's straight out of Bosch. We see a hobby horse with a shadow behind as if it's leaving the wall, and then we see a real horse that is flying out the window. This is incredible. After living in Europe, she was British, she was living in Europe for a long time, having this whole world of surrealism. She also had many bouts with mental illness, was in and out of institutions. She went and retired to Mexico, and that became her home until her death. This is her magical world of the Mayans, which shows the presence of mysticism, the presence of myth, even in the world as we see it. So that we have the underworld on the left, like in Bosch, we have the three different sections. We have the world of the humans in the middle. We see the churches. And on the right, the world of the gods. This is a mural that's in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Here's some details. You can see the size of it, the mystical figures, the rainbow that's coming out of the church, the snake-like figures as a sort of an angelic figure, all intertwined with the real. Diego Rivera did the same thing a couple of times. This is one of the murals. This is the one that's at the National Palace. Down below, we have the world of the Mayans and the gods and the mythology. And then up above, in each one of those niches, are various stages, eras in the history of Mexico. And in the mural that we've talked about, that you can go up now and see in the atrium at SF MoMA, San Francisco's Museum of Modern Art, Diego Rivera did the same thing. You see the Mayans at work on the left. In the middle, this godlike figure with a brown arm that is hearkening toward Mexico, and the industrial side hearkening toward the United States. Leonardo was also a sculptress. And here it's almost as if Bosch was able to take some of those images we saw at the very beginning of the class today and put them into metal. There's a lot that's been written about Leonora Carrington because of her fabulous life. And she herself is a writer. Here you have two of her books of short stories, and on the right, novels, and the one on the right is the one that's most famous, The Hearing Trumpet. And these are books of magical realism, just as we've been looking at surrealism in her art. Here is a painting of her done by her lover, Max Ernst. And other than that, I have a book with the same title as the painting, which is a novel based on her life. She and Max Ernst, very famous surrealist, were lovers. You see the photograph on the left, and on the right, her portrait of Max Ernst in a furry merman outfit, a freezing horse, a bubble-like lantern, and just fabulous socks. So we're going to talk about Max Ernst. Little Dada type of a photograph. You can see Dada written up there. He was both a Dadaist and a surrealist. It's hard to really split the two. This is his Barbarians. From what I understand, he was scared by a bird as a kid. So you often see it, I've written that on the side here, you often see him picturing evil type things as birds. He also had very unusual art craft that he used. For example, he would do rubbings, like you do rubbings of things that stand up and you rub a pencil over them. He would also fold over his canvas and like blot it to make it look like blottings, unusual techniques. So he combined these unusual ways of doing art with a surrealistic mentality. I think this is just to die for. The Triumph of Surrealism. This is his feeling about the end of the Spanish-American War, I mean the Spanish Civil War, where the fascists come into power. And this is an omen of what's going to happen, to depict the chaos and the ruin that's going to spread over Europe. He was a German who was not sympathetic to fascism, and therefore he self-exiled, came to the United States because of his views. This is his Europe after the rain. You can see that blotting technique that I talked about, also the scratching in this. But what we have are what look like ancient ruins that have been destroyed. It's hard to see, but that man holding the stake back there has the bird beak that I said appears in his work. But you can't help but think of the sites of devastation and war that we see every night on television. Here, close-ups, you can see the bird-like figure and these eerie formations of earth that he has as he's doing these pictures when he was still in Europe. And the really, really eerie thing that I found is, where should he exile himself to but to Sedona, Arizona, where I visit quite often because my surrogate daughter lives there. And those magical, magical rocks in Sedona, as many times as I visit, they never lose their mystical, magical quality. And you can see him on the left, Sedona, the rocks of Sedona in the middle. On the right, with his last wife. He did not marry Leonora Carrington. He left her in Europe. He also married Peggy Guggenheim, who was a friend of the Surrealists and has her own museum in Venice. She's part of the other Guggenheim Museum family. So his final wife was Dorothea Tanning, who was a wonderful surrealist. Here you see her with her easel, a picture that Ernst said me and DT on, and this is a self-portrait on her birthday. It looks like a rather nice self-portrait until you realize that her skirt is covered with frogs, and then you look at the doors that open and open and open on the side, and a character on the floor that looks so much like something out of Goya, when we said the sleep of reason brings monsters. The next surrealist is Giorgio de Chirico. You can see him, fun guy, up at the top, playing sort of a Dadaist kind of a thing, working on one of his masterpieces down below. This is one of his most famous works. I like the explanation of this work that's going to be in the video we look at in a minute. Before we do so, just check out, what do you see? With surrealism, we have very recognizable objects. The objects themselves are pretty normal. Let's look at a video talking about this work.
Earlier this year, when so many millions of us were confined to our homes, newspapers and TVs and phones filled with images of the abandoned world beyond our walls, a world built by us, for us, without us. It was odd, eerie, the kind of imagery you only ever see in post-apocalyptic movies. City centers, normally crowded with bodies, empty, except for some hungry and probably deeply confused pigeons. It reminded me of the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico, an Italian artist who was a founder of the metaphysical art movement. In 1909, de Chirico was sitting on a bench in the Piazza Santa Croce in Florence, recovering from an intestinal illness, when all of a sudden he had a profound experience. The whole world, down to the marble of the buildings and fountains, seemed to me to be convalescent. De Chirico glimpsed a reality behind appearances in which everything was healing like he was. From that experience came this painting, The Enigma of an Autumn Afternoon, which reproduces the Piazza Santa Croce but with a few changes. Most notably, the basilica facade is stripped of all its detail and its shape is altered. It appears also to be only the facade. You can see through the tops of the doors to the blue sky beyond. The structure behind it has disappeared. In the actual piazza, a statue of Dante stands in front of the basilica. In this version, the statue's head has disappeared too, and its position has been moved. Beside it, two small, lonely figures stand together, casting long shadows in the unusually empty square. The enigma here is in the relationship between de Chirico's impression that day in the piazza and the painting it ultimately produced. This and all the plazas in his Metaphysical Town Square series are simplified, empty, cut with dramatic shadows. They feature recurring motifs like those heavy shadows, or Roman arcades, or statues in the foreground, tall cylindrical buildings in the background, and trains in the distance. These are spaces we know, but they're rendered dreamlike by de Chirico's compositions. The revelation he feels can't be communicated by a realistic depiction of the world, or for that matter, a realistic depiction of vision. He admired the Impressionists and the Pointillists for their experimentation, but believed they didn't go far enough. To see reality without the mediating filter of our ideas about it, the world must be made new for the viewer, and to make the world new, it must be made strange. The artist must live in the world as if in an immense museum of strangeness, full of curious, multicolored toys which can change their appearance. It was the strangeness of de Chirico's paintings, their mystery and hallucinatory quality, that made him such an influence on the Surrealists. They too wanted to capture a world of dream logic, in which something profound could arise from irrational juxtapositions and spontaneous creation. In 1924, the year Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto, de Chirico traveled to Paris and was accepted into the group. But by then he had moved on from his metaphysical phase and returned to older forms of painting. The Surrealists trashed his new work, and de Chirico cut ties with them in an acrimonious split. He kept working through the rest of his life, all 90 years of it, but as is often the case, never enjoyed the same success he did during his early period. But it is those early works, those bizarre, melancholy town squares, that came to my mind when the coronavirus tore through the world and cleared our public spaces of people. For a little while, cities and towns became immense museums of strangeness, and it was possible to see what we built through alien eyes. What kind of species would make such monuments? What drove them to design their world like this?
It's interesting to think about how we can use different eyes to look out. We're just like in literature, we're so used to words meaning certain things that we never look between the words or between the lines. And de Chirico is saying, let's take out all the stuff we already understood. I recently went to a lecture by an art professor from Stanford who talked about telling his students it was a class on Van Gogh. He said, go out and look at the world as if you were looking through Van Gogh's eyes. I have a friend who's in this class who's soon to be going to Florence, and I'm wondering if perhaps she might see Florence a little bit differently after just seeing perhaps Fra Angelico's work there, and also looking at de Chirico's piazzas. Here's two of his self-portraits, definitely in a mood of the Renaissance, those draperies that he framed himself with. Looks like there's a little bit of whimsy going on, particularly in the way he's looking at the viewer through his self-portraits. Just like when we were looking at the Yuji Hiratsuka's work, remember the Japanese painter who did the people with the weird heads and sort of signifying things? I see that in some of de Chirico's people. Here is his poet and a muse. The muse is equipped with barbells and all sorts of things inside that might inspire the muse, who seems to be without any inspiration at the moment. Once again, we see the archaeologist with all of the things inside. We're taking away the faces. We don't need to look at facial expressions in order to express a person. On the right, a Bible story, the prodigal son, where we see a very modern looking or normal looking person embracing the prodigal son who's coming back, again, the barbells, coming back from his tomfooleries. Now I know what you think. Well, I know what I thought when I saw the aviator glasses. They have become a meme for our current president. Now, these don't have temples, but I couldn't help but just concentrating on that. But this is Guillaume Apollinaire. He was mentioned about surrealism. He wrote the manifesto. He was a poet. He was a great sponsor, member, father figure to the surrealists. He was wounded in World War I. He did not die from his wounds, but he was weakened a great deal and died not too long after, at a young age. On the right is the portrait of him done by Henri Matisse. Remember Rousseau? We looked at his dream. We said that he's sort of thought of as sort of a hack, self-taught. The style of this is the sort of a primitive look. That's Apollinaire on the right. And next to him is his mistress, Marie Laurencin. So we'll pause to look a little bit at Marie Laurencin, the way she really looks in her self-portrait and in a photograph of her. Here's the work that she did. Once again, we're doing an apotheosis sort of Apollinaire in the middle. Almost looks like he has a halo behind him. And next to him, you might notice the young, yes, Picasso's peeking his head in. On the right, there's Marie Laurencin. She's quite noticeable, I think, because she has those sparkly eyes. Notice the positioning of her dress and her position. Picasso, one of his most famous work is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Avignon was a street in Paris where there was a brothel. These are prostitutes that he posed, some of them behind African masks. And on the right, the bottom one, it is said that he's sort of copying the portrait of Marie Laurencin. So he puts her into his portrait of prostitutes the way she put him in the portrait with Apollinaire. Here's Picasso's drawing of him on the left and a cubistic rendered portrait of him on the right. We won't take time to try to find all of his parts. One of the things that Apollinaire did was shape poems. Here you have one that was done on the Eiffel Tower, on the left in French, which was originally on the right. You can see the lines, greetings there are, of which the eloquent tongue which pokes from your mouth, O Paris, and will poke forever at the Germans. So it is a poke at the enemy. Here's one that he did to a hat. Recognize yourself, this adorable person. And then he goes down through anatomy a little bit lower at the end, your heart that beats. And I thought about Matisse's Woman with the Hat. Now we're going to a new artist, another one who's high among my favorites. You may recognize. On the right, you'll see me looking at that picture at SF MoMA, where I'm showing the size of the matchstick for posterity in case people need to know scale. Making my friend take my picture with this one. We're talking about Renee, another Renee who lost his feminine E at the end. Renee Magritte. Great, I think he has a great sense of humor. Now, I'm sure there's lots of other meanings to his work, but here you see his portrait as the everyman, dressed in a suit. He just came off and portrayed himself as just a man among men, a bourgeois. And here he is in a self-portrait, painting, looking at an egg, and thinking what comes from the egg as the bird.
When is a kiss not exactly a kiss? A landscape, more than just a landscape. Or a portrait, something, well, surreal. In the world of Belgian painter Renee Magritte, nothing is what it seems.
Magritte is all about making pictures that make you think about pictures. He's the artist who looks at ordinary objects, but in these extraordinary ways.
Like a fireplace with a locomotive dashing out under full steam, or this portrait of a man made of a birdcage.
This picture epitomizes sort of the way Magritte creates very clear pictures, and the longer you look, the more you realize that their meaning is absolutely unclear.
Anne Umland is the curator of The Mystery of the Ordinary, an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that focuses on the evolution of Magritte's work from 1926 to 1938.
It's a time when he makes quantitatively and conceptually more works in more modes, more varieties than he ever had before. It is this period when Magritte becomes Magritte.
Renee Magritte was born in Lessines, a small town in Belgium, in 1898. Not much is known about his childhood. His father was a textile merchant, and when Magritte was 13, his mother committed suicide.
I think what was probably even more impactful on him than the event of the death itself is that he would remain, when he was a young boy, locked in a room with this depressed woman. Honestly, if you wish to read back into the works, look at the type of spaces Magritte is depicting and think about how claustrophobic they are.
In 1927, Magritte joined André Breton, Salvador Dali, and other artists in Paris. They became known as the Surrealists, creating unexpected, often dreamlike imagery.
You both have an image, a self-image of Magritte practicing his craft, at the same time as you have an image of his conceptual process, because the more you look, you realize, of course, he's staring at an egg.
Right.
But what is he painting?
Painting a bird.
That he's painting a bird.
Challenging the viewer's perception of reality would become Magritte's hallmark. He was something of a paradox. While his works defied convention, there was nothing of the artistic about him. Images had already been embraced by popular culture. His apple was the inspiration for the Beatles' Apple record logo, and rock album covers mimicked his designs. And how about this eye? Look familiar?
And someone asked him what he thought about CBS appropriating his painting, The False Mirror, the eye filled with sky.
The famous eye was based on his painting.
On his painting. And he sort of felt indifferent about it because what CBS ended up with was just a symbol on a background that was aiming to sell something or brand something, whereas his painting had no purpose other than poetry.
Billionaire and avid collector Wilbur Ross understands that poetry. He owns 25 Magrittes.
Even Andy Warhol had Magritte. And I think you can argue that pop art couldn't have occurred without Magritte. Pre-Magritte, who would ever have painted a Campbell soup can?
Is it fair to say you are the world's largest private collector of Magritte?
Oh, I don't know. Probably the most active one right now.
Right.
It's just when you get obsessed, you get obsessed.
2 of Ross's paintings are on loan to the exhibition, which is the first solo Magritte show in New York City in more than 20 years.
What do you want people to feel and be left with after the show?
I'd like them to understand what a great modern artist Magritte is. He's always saying a picture is just a picture. An image is not the same as the thing itself.
In other words, look and think, because in the world of Renee Magritte, everything is open to interpretation.
So As I said, he was an everyman. That bowler that they call it in England, we call it a derby. Here he's showing characters that are all the same. They're being regulated. They're being told this is what life is like. You have to go through this sort of pattern. They are either rising or falling, looking like rain in front of an apartment building that was very much like the one that he lived in. Like with our artist that we looked at, Yuji Hiratsuka, he is obliterating the faces with either an apple, that's supposed to be a self-portrait on the left, or a dove. The sign of the bowler hat, the derby, again, in the apartment, Jack Lemmon was an everyman. He was kind of unformed. He was kind of a guy that, as we learned when we saw Malcolm's classes about the apartment, he was just going with the thing. When he put on that hat, boy, he thought he was, really going with the crowd. Chauncey, the gardener on the right, Peter Sellers, was completely unformed. He still was childlike, and he has that everyman kind of a look with his bowler hat. This one is depicting the Great War. And if you read what I have over at the side, it is very much like what we talked about, the Belle Epoque, when we talked about Proust and the other people that saw the vanishing of the end of what the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists celebrated, the Toulouse-Lautrec, Gay Paris era. And now with the war looming, we are obliterating the lady's face with that symbol of the women, the violets, and saying she's a seductress like war, and she's pulling us into it. The whole idea of words and images. This is one of his most famous, if not the most famous work, called The Treachery of Images. It is made up of lines and colors. Right now that you're looking at it, it's made it pixelated onto your screen. Because you've been conditioned, you see it as sort of three-dimensional and with a hole. And because you've learned the word pipe, you attach it to it, but it's not a pipe. Here is a play on that with "This is not an apple," and then a play on "This is not an apple" by Norman Rockwell. And I love these bizarro cartoons. Thank you, Brenda, for giving me all these cartoons that you send. I want you to cut down on sweets and try to get more fresh fruit, Monsieur McGree. And awesome photo bomb. And then in Rorschach's office, he's showing them each one of those images. And with each one, he says, not a pipe, not a pipe, not a pipe. I love all those images on the back wall there. The treachery of words, that's my expression. That's not the name, but these are the interpretation of dreams, which I again learned in Renee Curry's class, where we talk about the signified thing, the thing we call a pipe, and the signifier, which is just arbitrarily the word that starts in English with a P and ends with an E, a pipe. On the left, we see one in English where we put the word the door under a horse, kind of a mind blower. On the right, if you look at the ones down the right side, we have the moon, top right, the ceiling, and the desert. Arbitrary use of words. So many of the books that we've read in that class have to do with the inability of language to show reality. And that's the same thing that's true with art. This is one of his big collectors, mentors, Edward James on the left. Magritte told him exactly how to pose with this stone. And He did it. He sent the picture to Magritte and said, you can do it. Magritte was in Belgium, he was in England, and the resulting portrait is on the right. These were done also of Edward James, having the face come out of the back, and also the one on the right was done for his home. Once again, Edward James, not to be reproduced, and posing with the symbol of war and peace in the upper right. He loved Jingle Bells. So it was supposed to be because of the fact that he loved hearing the horses come down the street with Jingle Bells. So you find them all over the place. They just come in the strangest places. So in his surrealistic work, you can often look for Jingle Bells. Here is his lovers. Again, we're looking back. I mentioned this when we were looking at Yuji's work in the Flower People. And below, I said, we're going to be seeing this later on, but obliterating the faces is one of the things that Magritte did. There was a great Magritte show in SF MoMA, and all the people who helped wore these hats with the apple. They wore the apple on the back of their head. And then they had these places where you could pose and you could be part of a Magritte painting. Let's say we're going to skip this artist, so let's just go through fast. I thank the person who suggested it. We can start here. Surrealism surrounds us. It is something that now may or may not be influenced by the surrealist artists, but we see it all over. Here is an ad for cotton that reminded me of the Lagarde picture. An ad for Cartier with the image of the animal on the cement, and I thought of the Carrington piece. I love this Hermes with the clouds made of bubbles, comparing that to the Magritte. So look at this image. Think of what you think of it, how it might have been done, what it is. And I'm asking you, what is real and what is surreal? You can say yes or no to yourself. Now I'm going to tell you that this image is an undoctored photograph. And let's look at the video. And that was an undoctored video. So that's it. That's it for this term. I hope you can come back in the fall for even more masterpieces. And also we're going to be writing with the masterpieces. All of these classes are posted on my website, and you can look at the PowerPoint. Eventually we'll be having the recordings on there. If you're interested, this particular class, there was so much storytelling and stuff that you could write that when we do writing with the masterpieces, you can go back and choose any of them. But these questions that you have, and you put in some of them in the chat, you may just pose that question and do your own guessing, which I had to do a lot. So you can look at the website, just click at the top. You don't have to go through all the tomfoolery about my book, and press More Art Talk. You can add to the class. You can make requests. So contact me. You can email me through my website. Thank you so much.